Dominic Thiem's greatest tennis moment happened in an eerie silence, with more than 20,000 empty seats surrounding him. After battling for 4 hours against Alexander Zverev in the 2020 US Open final, Thiem collapsed to the ground, but instead of the usual deafening cheers of Arthur Ashe Stadium, all he heard were camera shutters and slightly scattered applause. It was far from the celebration typically reserved for a Grand Slam champion. Dominic Thiem's 2020 US Open win was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter in his career, but instead, it signaled the start of an unexpected decline. Soon after, his promising career took a downturn that no one saw coming. How did a career that looked so bright unravel so quickly? Today we'll explore Dominic Thiem's rise, fall, and final match on tennis's biggest stage. In this video, we'll explore 3 big questions. How did Dominic Thiem win the US Open in 2020 under such strange circumstances? What led to his quick decline after achieving his greatest success? What happened in his final Grand Slam match? And what's next for Thiem now that he's retired from tennis? Stick with us as we uncover the twists and turns in Thiem's career and see how one of tennis's brightest stars burned out so quickly. Before we dive into the US Open final, let's look at how Dominic Thiem got there. Thiem wasn't a stranger to Grand Slam finals before 2020. He had reached 3 of them, 2 at the French Open and 1 at the Australian Open. But each time he fell short. Why? Because he had to face the toughest possible opponents, Rafael Nadal and Novak Djokovic. Nadal, a 14-time French Open champion, beat Thiem twice at Roland Garros. And Djokovic, who's dominated the Australian Open, defeated him in Melbourne. So why were these losses so tough for Thiem? Thiem belonged to a generation of players who had constantly battled the big 3, Nadal, Djokovic, and Roger Federer. Alongside players like Andy Murray and Stan Wawrinka, Thiem was often overshadowed by their dominance. Every time he came close to a Grand Slam title, one of these greats was there to stop him. But all of that changed at the 2020 US Open. For the first time, the big 3 were not in the picture. Federer and Nadal skipped the tournament because of the pandemic, and Djokovic was disqualified in the 4th round after accidentally hitting a line judge. With those 3 out of the way, Thiem had a clear path to his first Grand Slam title. Everything seemed to be finally lining up for him. But the road to victory wasn't as easy as it seemed. In the US Open final, Thiem faced Alexander Zverev, and from the very start, things didn't look good for him. Thiem had lost only 1 set during the entire tournament leading up to the final. But against Zverev, he quickly fell far behind. He lost the first 2 sets and struggled to find any rhythm. I already felt before the match that something was not right, Thiem admitted later. I wasn't in the zone, and I was way too intense, too nervous. Zverev, meanwhile, was playing at a high level and seemed well on his way to an easy victory. But Thiem didn't give up. He fought back, winning the next 2 sets to force a 5th set. Zverev served for the match at 5-3 in the final set, but Thiem broke his serve, keeping his chances alive. The match went to a final set tiebreak, and both players were physically and mentally exhausted. Thiem, cramping and struggling to serve, faced a nervous Zverev, whose second serve slowed to just 68 miles per hour, and he hit 2 costly double faults. Thiem's fearlessness in the critical moments made the difference. He fired 2 forehand winners to clinch the tiebreak and claim his first ever Grand Slam title. Unfortunately for Thiem, there were no fans in the stands to see his victory. So what happened after this career-defining win? Thiem's US Open victory should have been the beginning of something big for him, but instead, it marked the start of a difficult period in his career. Just a few months after his triumph, Thiem suffered a serious wrist injury during a match against Adrian Mannarino in Spain. For any tennis player, a wrist injury is one of the worst injuries you can have because it affects your ability to control the racket. Thiem's aggressive playing style, which involved heavy topspin and hard-hitting shots, had finally taken a toll on his body. The injury sidelined Thiem for most of the 2021 season, and even when he returned, he wasn't the same player. By 2024, he had only won one ATP Tour match and had dropped to 209th in the world rankings. The player who had once been ranked number 3 in the world was now struggling just to compete, and it became clear that his time at the top was over. In 2024, Thiem returned to the US Open as a wildcard entry, but it would be his last Grand Slam tournament. In the first round, he faced young American Ben Shelton. After a competitive first set, Thiem faded and eventually lost 6-4, 6-2, 6-2. But the end of the match was emotional. The announcer called for applause for Shelton, but Shelton refused to take the spotlight. Instead, he waved his racket, urging the crowd to give their appreciation to Thiem, a player who had been one of the best over the last decade. Thiem reflected on the moment, saying, "I've had my greatest success on this court in the weird 2020, under very strange and different circumstances. Unfortunately, I had this success without any of you." Shelton, acknowledging Thiem's achievements, said that having 4 Grand Slam finals and 1 title is something every tennis player dreams about as a kid. So why did Thiem finally decide to retire? Thiem had won just one of his 8 ATP Tour matches in 2024 before his US Open defeat, and his ranking had dropped sharply. It wasn't just the lack of wins, it was the fact that the wrist injury from 2021 had left him unable to compete at the level he once did. Thiem knew he couldn't continue in this diminished state, and surgery didn't seem like a viable option. "There wasn't a particular moment I decided to retire," Thiem explained, "but toward the end of last year, I was working hard, putting in a lot of hours, and the steps were going in the right direction, but were just not satisfying for me." Thiem made peace with his decision, knowing he wasn't playing at the level he had been 3 or 4 years earlier. He had no intent in carrying on in a diminished state, and it was time to step away from the sport. His 2020 US Open win will always be remembered, but it's his hard work, mental toughness, and humility that made him one of the most respected players in the game. Thiem may be retiring from professional tennis, but his impact on the sport will last. He's talked about staying involved in tennis, possibly through coaching or commentary. Thiem also has big plans outside of tennis, such as starting a sustainable football club inspired by Forest Green Rovers. And he looks forward to starting a family with his partner, Lily Paul Roncalli. Thiem's time on the court may be over, but his story isn't. As he said himself, "I consider myself lucky to have competed with the greatest players of all time." That's a legacy any athlete would be proud of.